Let's just picture this for a second. You're sitting in a completely normal team meeting. Nobody's shouting, right? There's no obvious conflict happening. You're just talking, going through the agenda, and decisions are being made. But beneath the surface of all that, there are these invisible emotional forces completely shifting the room. Someone's tone drops just a fraction. A single sentence gets framed in a highly specific way. A tiny, almost undetectable emotional angle slips in. And then, without anyone even realizing it, a decision forms that literally wasn't there a minute ago. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into something deeply fascinating and honestly a little bit unsettling: the psychology of manipulation and invisible influence in leadership. Where exactly does control begin? It's a pretty stark question, isn't it? We tend to think of manipulation as this big cinematic thing, like some villain actively pulling the strings from the shadows. But in the real world, influence is rarely that loud. In fact, the absolute best manipulation doesn't feel forced at all. It just feels like thinking. It feels like making a conscious choice. It feels like agreement. And if influence can shape a team's decisions without ever actually being noticed, well, we really have to rethink everything we know about how we lead and how we follow.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The invisible shift, when choice is an illusion. Let's break down the actual mechanics of how influence just totally blends into our everyday interactions. The human brain is always processing meaning, right? But meaning is entirely shaped by context. Just look at this progression. It doesn't happen all at once. First off, it's just a suggestion. It feels open, helpful, totally harmless. But then, the context shifts just a little bit, and suddenly that suggestion turns into advice. It's a little firmer now. Give it a moment, and the emotional tone shifts it into an expectation. And finally, without a single aggressive or demanding word being spoken, it hardens right into an obligation. The whole transition is so slow, so methodical, it's practically invisible to the person experiencing it. Section 2. Emotion bypasses logic. The vulnerable entry point.
Look, we all love to believe that our teams operate like these purely logical, rational systems, but they absolutely don't. Emotion always hits the brain first. It completely bypasses our analytical defenses, and logic just builds a little scaffolding around it after the fact. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how skilled manipulators, whether they're doing it on purpose or not, actually operate. They don't waste time arguing the logic. They adjust the emotional tone. Think about it. A calm statement is processed as reassuring. But if you deliver that exact same statement with just a hint of unspoken tension, suddenly it feels like pressure. The entire reality of the room just resets itself, completely based on delivery.
Section 3. Framing team decisions. The architecture of agreement. Let's put you directly into a scenario we've all been in. You are in a meeting, and you desperately need your team to take on a massive, totally unexpected workload. How do you actually get them to say yes? Notice the stark difference between these two approaches. On the one hand, you have a direct request. Can you do this? It's simple. It leaves room for a straightforward, logical yes or no. But look at the framed request. You remind them of past successes together. You lean heavily on trust. You imply this shared responsibility for the very survival of the company. You're not explicitly demanding anything, but the emotional structure of the conversation has fundamentally changed. This kind of subtle framing ties a refusal directly to social discomfort. So suddenly saying no feels incredibly heavy, incredibly burdensome, all because the emotional context was expertly built around them. Which brings us to Section 4. The conformity trap. The social expense of disagreement. The thing is, manipulation isn't always this deliberate Machiavellian master plan. A lot of the time, it happens completely organically when teams unconsciously adapt to authority figures and, well, to each other. It really starts here. Biologically, psychologically, we humans are literally wired to mirror each other. When a leader leans in, the whole team leans in. When tension spikes, the collective mind of the group immediately looks for ways to bring it back down. We have this deep evolutionary urge to just adopt whatever viewpoints will lower the temperature of the room. And because of that intense mirroring, people avoid conflict. They just do. Over time, in so many corporate cultures, you'll see teams start to unanimously agree. But here's the catch. They aren't agreeing because they're totally sold on the logic of the spreadsheet or the brilliance of the strategy. They are agreeing because disagreeing has simply become way too socially expensive. And that leads to a pretty terrifying truth for literally any organization. Belonging outweighs accuracy. Every single time. Emotional safety and group acceptance will almost always crush intellectual certainty inside a meeting room. True influence doesn't have to be forceful. It just has to make agreeing feel a whole lot easier than resisting. Section 5, destabilizing self-trust, the outer limits of influence. Now, we do need to touch on the extreme end of psychological manipulation in the workplace. What happens when this architecture of agreement goes way too far? We throw this word around a lot these days, but let's look at its clinical anatomy. Gaslighting. This happens when repeated framing actually alters a person's perception of their own memory. They legitimately begin to doubt their internal reality. And it's not because reality actually shifted, it's because their confidence in their own perception has been systematically dismantled. When a team member's self-trust is destabilized like that, their mind inevitably has to outsource certainty. And it outsources it to authority, to the loudest voice in the room, or to the narrative that gets repeated the most. Thankfully, though, most everyday manipulation in leadership is way less extreme than full-blown gaslighting. Usually it's just made up of tiny adjustments in perception. A subtle suggestion during a one-on-one, an idea that gets casually repeated in the weekly sync, quiet social reinforcement from peers. It's like small, repeated drops of water that eventually carve out a massive canyon. Until eventually, that manipulated idea feels completely natural to the entire team, like it was always their brilliant idea to begin with. Section 6, the power of pause, arming the leader. So how do we actually defend ourselves against this invisible psychological threat? Well, we have to learn to weaponize awareness and distance. Look, the crucial point is not whether influence exists. It is constant, it's always there. The real question is whether you can spot it while it's happening. On the one side, without awareness, influence is just invisible guidance. You're basically just a passenger along for the ride. But on the flip side, with awareness, it becomes an observable structure. You start to see the framing. You can actually hear the subtle shifts in tone. And the second you make influence observable, it instantly loses its grip. It becomes far less controlling. But to build up that kind of awareness, we are fighting an uphill battle against the modern workplace. The sheer speed of modern work demands quick agreement, rapid disagreement, instant emotional reactions on Slack, fast-paced decisions on endless Zoom calls. But this relentless, exhausting speed, that is exactly the environment manipulation thrives in. It relies on speed to bypass your critical reflection. It wants to keep your attention totally trapped inside the emotion of that specific moment. Because reflection requires distance, and distance is exactly what manipulation often reduces. Let that sink in for a second. As a leader, your absolute greatest defense is the pause. Demanding a pause creates that necessary distance, and in that quiet distance, all that manufactured emotional pressure just kind of dissolves, and you can finally see the framing for what it truly is. Section 7, the constant influence, reclaiming reality. Look, recognizing these subtle tactics, it's not about becoming totally paranoid. And it is certainly not a how-to guide for controlling other people. It's really about preventing your own perception from being invisibly shaped by the environment around you. And I promise, once you see how influence really works, you are going to start noticing it absolutely everywhere. In your team, in the media you consume, even in yourself. Which leaves us with one final kind of haunting question to think about today. Look back at your career, really look back at your life. How many of your decisions were fully yours, and how many were gently guided into feeling like they were? I'm going to leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the frame.